Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! Okinawa, 1945. 10 Korean girls were found together near a Japanese supply post after United States Marines entered the area. The original caption says, "Wartime poverty led their families to sell them." In Dane, Loska Dolina, Italian soldiers lined up Slovenian civilian hostages in front of a firing squad. The photo captures the final seconds before they were shot. The last known photo of Albert Lowenstein shows one of the world's richest men boarding his plane in 1928. He vanished during the flight, and investigators concluded he fell from the aircraft. An Indian woman with leprosy was photographed in Srinagar in 1969. Untreated cases can slowly damage the skin, nerves, hands, and face. She was promoted as more than 8 feet tall and kept performing into her early 60s. Before the stage, she worked as a live-in housekeeper, then toured Europe and Australia as both a singer and a sideshow star. Inajiro Asanuma is seen being rushed toward a hospital car in Tokyo on October 12, 1960, after a 17-year-old attacker rushed the stage during a live debate. The Japan Socialist Party chairman died that day at age 61. Serra Pelada, Brazil, 1986. Thousands of miners climbed this open pit on wooden ladders and carried earth by hand. The mine reached about 80,000 people at its peak. Serbian soldiers on the Salonika front moved an entire hut by hand during World War I. Taken between 1916 and 1918, the photo records a camp building being repositioned without vehicles or machinery. At No-Gun-Rai in South Korea, marked bullet impacts still cover the tunnel where war refugees were killed in July 1950. Investigations estimated about 250 to 300 people died here, including many women and children. Angola, 1997. Children attended class inside a school with broken walls and exposed steel. The country's civil war lasted from 1975 to 2002. Mike Tyson hugs Cus D'Amato, the trainer who took him in as a teenager and became his legal guardian in 1980. Cus passed away in 1985, just 1 year before Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in history at age 20. In 1961, George Lincoln Rockwell posed in Virginia with members of the American Nazi Party beside a painted propaganda bus built for public rallies. The group had been founded in 1959, and this vehicle turned extremist politics into a traveling street spectacle across the United States. Belgian pilot Fernand Jacques posed in 1916 beside his Farman 40, painted with a giant skull that turned the aircraft into one of the strangest sights in the sky. The Farman 40 entered service in 1915 and was built mainly for aerial observation. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin launched aboard Vostok 1 and became the first human to reach space. The flight lasted 108 minutes and changed history with a mission that began on a single pillar of fire. A German camouflage suit stands beside a hollow steel tree built in 1918 to hide a soldier in plain sight. These fake trees were often set up at night in place of a damaged real tree, so the field looked almost unchanged by morning. A British soldier sits inside a broken bathtub on ground so damaged that almost no full tree is left standing. During 1914 to 1918, whole homes were torn apart near the front, leaving ordinary objects like this in places that no longer looked human. In the 1980s, milk cartons in the United States carried photos and case details of missing children, turning an everyday item into a national alert. At its peak, the campaign placed these faces on breakfast tables in millions of homes each morning. In 1924, nearly 1 million people filled the streets of Buenos Aires to welcome the Prince of Italy, turning the city center into a solid mass of faces and hats. Argentina had one of the largest Italian communities in the world. On August 9, 1945, this cloud rose over Nagasaki after the second atomic weapon ever used in war. By the end of 1945, the city had lost about 60,000 to 80,000 people, making this one of the most consequential images of the 20th century. On May 25, 1986, about 5 million people joined hands across America, standing hand in hand across major parts of the United States. The planned route ran from New York to California through 17 states, turning ordinary roads into one of the biggest public displays of the decade. A Soviet inmate in the 1980s displays chest tattoos of Lenin and Stalin, part of a prison code where every image could signal status, loyalty, or defiance. Many such tattoos were made by hand with improvised needles and soot-based ink. A British soldier signals beside a chieftain tank during a NATO training drill in West Germany in the late 1980s, with dust turning the scene almost unreal. The chieftain entered British service in 1966 and remained one of the country's main battle tanks until the 1990s. In 1941, Italian airmen in Ukraine spelled Buon Natale in shells beside their aircraft, creating a holiday message in one of the coldest places imaginable. A Libyan soldier of the 10th Army trains with a Solothurn S 18-1000, a shoulder weapon so large it almost fills the frame. This Swiss-designed model used 20mm ammunition and became one of the most unusual anti-tank rifles of its era. A Wehrmacht correspondent types from the Eastern Front in 1941, while horsemen fade through the background behind him. German propaganda units sent writers, photographers, and cameramen close to the front, then turned their reports into newspapers, photos, and film for audiences back home. In February 1941, German Red Cross nurses handed out drinks to Wehrmacht soldiers at Hasselt Station in Belgium, creating a surprisingly calm scene beside the rail cars. Belgium had been under German control since May 1940. In 1946, the Iran crisis turned the new United Nations Security Council into the stage for one of the first Cold War confrontations, as Tehran challenged the continued presence of Soviet troops in northern Iran. International pressure soon forced a Soviet withdrawal. In June 1941, this image captured German troops and local collaborators holding a looted Torah scroll beside a synagogue in flames in Lithuania. It was taken in the first days of Operation Barbarossa. Bandaged survivors of the 1919 Khodorkovsky pogrom stand before the camera, turning one moment of the Russian Civil War into a permanent record. During the war, anti-Jewish pogroms across Ukraine took more than 100,000 Jewish lives. In 1923, a German civilian faced a French soldier during the occupation of the Ruhr, after France and Belgium took control of Germany's main industrial region over unpaid reparations. The Ruhr produced most of Germany's coal and steel. Red Army assault engineer sappers moved through Küstrin in 1945, wearing SN-42 steel body armor, a rare sight that made them look almost machine-made. The armor was designed to reduce damage from shrapnel and some close-range pistol fire during street fighting. A bus sign in the 1950s quietly divided riders by race, turning an ordinary seat into a line of segregation. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days and helped push the United States toward ending legal bus segregation. In 1954, Marilyn Monroe smiles in Korea as she signs a poster based on a 1946 image that had already become one of her most famous early poses. During that tour, she gave 10 shows in 4 days for more than 100,000 United States troops. On February 25, 1981, Apple chief executive Michael Scott dismissed 40 employees in a single day, turning one office decision into company legend. Soon after, he was moved to vice chairman, a title with little real power. On September 17, 1939, Red Army soldiers handed out Pravda newspapers near Vilnius as Soviet forces entered eastern Poland. The scene came on the first day of the Soviet advance, just 16 days after Germany attacked from the west. On a hot New York night in 1948, a fire escape became a bedroom above the street. Before home air conditioning was common, many city families spent summer nights by open windows, on rooftops, or outside to escape the heat. The Krumlauf bent the barrel of a Sturmgewehr 44 so the rifle could aim around corners or from behind cover. The 30-degree version lasted about 300 shots, while the 45-degree version lasted about 160. On April 28, 1943, this ceremony marked the creation of the Galician Division under German rule, with raised arms turned into a carefully staged public display. About 80,000 men applied, but only a fraction were accepted into the unit. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe appeared at a New York after-party following John F. Kennedy's birthday celebration in the same glittering dress that became instant legend. The skin-tight gown was covered with more than 2,500 crystals. In September 1980, these photos showed a young nursery assistant caring for children just months before she was pulled into the center of royal attention. They were taken before the February 1981 engagement announcement. At a Los Angeles dinner in 1959, a Hollywood star sat among guests honoring a Soviet leader, turning one room into a small Cold War spectacle. The September 1959 trip was the first United States visit by a Soviet leader, and the two reportedly met that same evening. Behind Lincoln's head on Mount Rushmore is a hidden granite chamber started in 1938 as a hall of records. The room was never finished, and in 1998, a sealed titanium vault with key historical texts was placed inside, where visitors still cannot enter. In March 1943, a Japanese American from Hawaii waits to enlist at a time when people of the same ancestry were under heavy suspicion across the United States. That year, volunteers from Hawaii helped form units that became some of the most decorated in United States military history. In 1958, Tyrone Power collapsed on the Madrid set of Solomon and Sheba, turning a normal filming day into the end of a major Hollywood career. He was 44, and the film was later completed with Yul Brynner in his role. By 1996, Ukraine had sent away the last Soviet nuclear warheads from its territory, giving up what had briefly been the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal. The move followed the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, under which Russia, the United States, a barefoot newsboy stands with his papers, part of the huge army of street children who sold newspapers across American cities around the start of the 1900s. Some began at age 4 and had to buy their bundles first, so a bad day could leave them with no money at all. In the 1940s, women stepped into factories like this one and kept wartime production moving when millions of men were away. By 1945, nearly 1 in 4 married women in the United States were working. In 1946, Abby Stockton balances on a man's hands at Muscle Beach in Santa Monica while pressing 135 pounds above her head. She became one of the first famous female strength stars in the United States, performing in public when women's weightlifting was still rare. In 1943, a young woman known as Katya stands at the center of a Belarusian partisan group in the Gomel region. Her real name was Varvara Virvich. She was born in 1922, and she served as a Komsomol organizer in the underground movement. In 1944, Arthur Axmann inspects a teenage fire team from Germany's state youth organization, a stark image of how young the war had reached. By the final year of the war, boys this age were being drawn into defense roles as Germany ran short of trained men. German soldiers stand near Königsberg on April 10, 1945, just after the collapse of East Prussia's main stronghold. Königsberg had surrendered to Soviet forces on April 9th, turning this photo into a next-day record of the city's final defeat. In 1970, this Oakland police trainee became the department's first black woman officer, stepping into a role almost no one like her had been allowed to hold. The image shows a historic first during range training at a time when black women were still rare in American policing. John Truden was a standout name in heavyweight skiing, a little-known class where larger athletes raced in their own division. In the early 1970s, he won multiple titles, turning one of the strangest corners of winter sport into his own domain. In 1939, Dust Bowl migrants loaded whole homes onto cars like this and drove west to start again. By the late 1930s, hundreds of thousands had left the southern plains after drought and crop failure turned once rich farmland into dust. In 1912, the Confederate Veterans Special ended in a twisted wreck in Mississippi while carrying veterans to a reunion. About 70 to 80 Confederate veterans lost their lives in the crash on May 6th. In 1973, Roger Williamson crashed at Zandvoort after a tire failure, and this frame captured one of motor racing's most tragic moments. He was 25 and died from smoke inhalation, while fellow driver David Purley tried to free him. In 1938, a coal miner in West Virginia spends free time with his family outside a Warren Company house. In many coal towns, the mine controlled wages, housing, and the company store at the same time. In 1962, a Soviet pilot on Kamchatka feeds bear cubs from the door of a Mi-1 helicopter, creating a scene that feels almost unreal. The Mi-1 was the first mass-produced Soviet helicopter and had entered service in the early 1950s. In 1963, John F. Kennedy was photographed in Rome as Alfredo Di Lelio served the pasta dish first created in 1908. Kennedy's July 1963 visit was his only official trip to Italy as president. At the start of the 1900s, Japanese immigrants reached Santa Rosalia in Baja California by small boat, packed among trunks, bags, and straw hats. Japanese migration to Mexico began in the late 1800s. In 1982, the cruiser General Belgrano went down in the South Atlantic after a British torpedo strike during the Falklands War. The sinking cost 323 Argentine lives and became one of the most consequential moments of the conflict. A United States Geological Survey scientist stands beside a pole in California's San Joaquin Valley, where the ground sank so much that the 1925 and 1955 levels sit far above the 1977 surface. Years of heavy groundwater pumping caused nearly 9 meters of sinking here. In 1960s London, a man walked through busy streets with an almost blind sign pinned to his back so others could see his condition at a glance. In 1945, an American soldier stands inside Leipzig's damaged monument to the Battle of the Nations, with giant stone faces rising over the wreckage. The monument was built from 1898 to 1913 to mark Napoleon's defeat in 1813. In March 1973, American prisoners of war stood for roll call in the yard of Na Tu So prison in Hanoi during the final weeks before release. That same year, Operation Homecoming brought 591 United States prisoners back from North Vietnam. Bosnian soldiers pause for a photo in a trench line in 1915, while one man keeps digging in the background. The image captures the trench still being expanded at the exact moment the camera stopped them. On April 6, 1970, journalists Sean Flynn and Dana Stone disappeared in Cambodia while chasing one more story, and neither was ever seen again. Flynn was the son of film star Errol Flynn, which turned their fate into one of the most famous unresolved cases of the Indochina War. Believed to be the last known photo of Joseph Stalin, this image was taken on February 28, 1953, just before the sudden collapse that ended his rule. He died 4 days later at age 74, closing nearly 30 years at the top of the Soviet system. In North Africa in 1941, tank crews sometimes used sun-heated armor as a field stove, turning a combat vehicle into a kitchen by midday. Desert heat shaped the campaign as much as the enemy, with machines, food, and water all pushed to their limits. In 1943, food carriers hauled insulated containers from field kitchens to forward positions, making them one of the least remembered jobs in the Wehrmacht. Hot food often reached the line only once a day, and a single container could carry soup, coffee, or stew for an entire squad. Deutsches Jungvolk was the 10 to 14 age branch of Hitler Youth. By the final war years, even boys that young were being drawn into labor and emergency duties. Königsberg fell in April 1945 after one of the last major battles in East Prussia. Within months, the German city was renamed Kaliningrad and absorbed into the Soviet Union. In 1897, men in Sweden could still be jailed for same-sex relationships. The law stayed in force until 1944, which makes this photo a record of how late that punishment lasted. World War I trench fighting brought back weapons that looked medieval because long rifles were awkward in narrow dugouts. Austro-Hungarian troops used spiked clubs like these for close combat from 1914 to 1918. In 2000, images like this became one of the defining symbols of the Second Intifada, marked by the stark contrast between stones and armor. The uprising lasted until 2005 and reshaped Israeli-Palestinian politics for years. In 1973, a trailer carrying 20 tons of dynamite exploded on Interstate 44 near Springfield, Missouri, ripping a huge crater through the highway. Investigators said the load was set off by rifle fire, making it one of the strangest road disasters in Missouri history. Anderson shelters were made of corrugated steel and buried in gardens across Britain from 1939. More than 2 million were issued, and this 30-foot crater in 1944 shows how little distance could separate a family from an air raid. On September 11, 2001, Rick Rescorla used a megaphone to lead Morgan Stanley employees out of the World Trade Center, helping save many lives. He kept directing others to safety and did not survive when the South Tower fell. In 1926, Stockholm was shaken by one of its earliest known car bomb cases. The blast was so powerful that investigators found parts of the victim about 100 meters from the wreck. In 1926, Stockholm was shaken by one of its earliest known car bomb cases. The blast was so powerful that investigators found parts of the victim about 100 meters from the wreck. More than 40,000 fingerprints were checked in this investigation, making it one of the largest early fingerprint dragnets in Britain. The case showed how police were trying to solve major crimes with mass forensic screening long before DNA existed. In 1947, Benjamin Ferencz became chief prosecutor in the Einsatzgruppen trial at just 27 years old. He was the last surviving Nuremberg prosecutor and spent the rest of his life pushing for justice after wartime atrocities. On May 21, 1988, Soviet troops were already crossing back through Termez just 6 days after the Afghanistan withdrawal began. The full pullout ended on February 15, 1989, closing a nearly 10-year campaign that cost about 15,000 Soviet lives. This 1926 funeral photo froze the Soviet elite together just before Stalin turned on the old Bolshevik leadership. Trotsky was expelled in 1927 and exiled in 1929, while Kamenev and Zinoviev were later put to death. The Dollaro crash on May 27, 1971, became one of West Germany's most remembered rail disasters after 46 lives were lost, many of them students on a school trip. A misunderstood hand signal sent 2 trains onto the same single track. In 1910, many newsboys in St. Louis began work before sunrise and had to buy their paper bundles before earning a single cent. A bad sales day could leave a child owing money instead of making it. In 1985, Jeremy Bamber appeared at these funerals before the White House farm case turned into one of Britain's most disputed criminal trials. In 1986, he was convicted of killing 5 members of his family and given a whole life sentence. In 1928, this secret photo of Ruth Snyder became one of the most famous forbidden images in American press history because reporters were banned from the execution room. The camera was strapped to the photographer's ankle. On June 28, 1922, the Four Courts explosion turned the opening day of the Irish Civil War into a disaster for Ireland's historical record. In a single blast, centuries of state papers, court files, and genealogical records were lost forever. A price list scratched into a wall in Galveston preserved the money of a vice trade that once operated with striking openness before the 1950s. After the 1901 Balangiga attack, General Jacob Smith ordered a harsh campaign on Samar and said boys as young as 10 should be treated as enemies. The order caused outrage in the United States, and Smith was court-martialed in 1902 but received only a formal reprimand. In 1958, a snapped high-voltage cable in Mexico City left a passerby badly injured, yet he survived. The image became a stark reminder that one power line failure could turn an ordinary city street into a disaster in seconds. By 1945, abandoned war ammunition was so common in Europe that children sometimes handled it without understanding the danger. Panzerfaust launchers were cheap one-use anti-tank weapons made in the millions. In 1965, this Chicago case drew national attention because 3 teenagers were accused of killing an elderly man for excitement rather than need. All 3 were released within 10 years, which made the case even more shocking to many Americans. In 1949, Yemenite Jews were flown to Israel in Operation Magic Carpet, one of the most dramatic airlifts of the 20th century. In about 1 year, nearly 49,000 people were moved, including communities that had lived in Yemen for centuries. Gleaning was the last right of the poor, letting families gather what landowners and harvest crews left behind. In 1918, even neutral Sweden lived under wartime shortage, and in the far north, a few leftover stalks could still matter. During World War I, public shaming was used to mark American deserters before formal punishment. 2,657 United States servicemen were convicted of desertion, and all 24 death sentences were later reduced to prison by Woodrow Wilson. In 1945, Piotr Hemy was executed at Landsberg, the same prison later used for many convicted Nazi war criminals. His case shocked post-war Europe because a man only recently freed from a concentration camp was condemned by the new authorities within months. The Heysel disaster in 1985 took 39 lives and became one of the darkest nights in football history. English clubs were banned from European competition for 5 years, and Liverpool for 6. Tarawa lasted only 76 hours in November 1943, but it cost the United States more than 1,000 fatalities and stunned the public back home. The battle exposed how deadly reefs and low tide could be, and it forced major changes in later Pacific landings. The Dublin and Monaghan bombings of 1974 were the deadliest single day of the Troubles in the Republic of Ireland, killing 33 people and an unborn child. No one was ever convicted, which left one of the most notorious unresolved cases in modern Irish history. In 1962, East German investigators searching the home of a former Auschwitz guard reportedly found personal items taken from people killed in the camp. The case was part of the delayed post-war hunt for camp staff. On August 21, 1968, Warsaw Pact forces entered Prague to end the Prague Spring and restore hardline control. The state radio building became one of the first key points because control of the broadcast meant control of the first hours of the invasion. In 1915, Austro-Hungarian troops in Galicia often punished civilians accused of helping Russia, sometimes with almost no proof at all. Fear of spies spread so fast on the Eastern Front that suspicion alone could decide a person's fate. 1959, Alberta police lined up the victims' shoes from age 3 to 53, turning ordinary footwear into one of the bleakest pieces of evidence in the Cook family case. The killings were later blamed on the eldest son, Robert Raymond Cook, who was executed in 1960. After Guam was retaken in 1944, Japanese holdouts remained hidden in the island's interior long after the main battle ended. By April 16, 1945, this tally had already reached 128, and by April 1946, the count rose to 176, while only 12 were captured alive. Between October 1944 and May 1945, nearly 25,000 civilians died in Batangas during the Japanese occupation. After the war, places like this well became evidence as investigators documented sites tied to those civilian losses. In 1941, Soviet women soldiers captured by Germany were often denied normal prisoner status from the moment they were taken. Because so few survived captivity, photos of Soviet female prisoners from that year are exceptionally rare. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments. Which historical shot did you like the most? And for what reason? During Liberia's first civil war, militia leaders like Jungle Jabba became notorious as armed factions splintered into personal commands feared across the country. The war ran from 1989 to 1997 and killed about 150,000 people while forcing around half of Liberia from their homes. By May 1942, the Long Branch plant in Ontario was helping mass produce Sten guns, one of the fastest emergency designs of the war. More than 4 million were made, with a simple stamped metal build that kept cost and production time low. In June 1999, United States troops entered Kosovo with K4R just after Yugoslav forces began pulling out. By the end of the conflict, more than 800,000 Kosovo Albanians had fled or been forced from their homes. The Rough Riders were the first United States volunteer cavalry, formed in 1898 for the war with Spain. They became famous in Cuba, where many fought on foot because their horses never made it overseas. George Spanky McFarland had been famous since the 1930s as one of the best-known faces from our gang. This later photo with Michael Jackson links early Hollywood directly to the pop era almost 50 years later. In 1964, Sidney Poitier became the first black actor to win the Academy Award for Best Actor. He won for Lilies of the Field, breaking one of Hollywood's biggest barriers. In 1961, Red Army choir accordionist Ivan Chermontai hit a high kick in midair while still playing during a performance in Ottawa. The Soviet troupe was touring Canada in 1961, and news captions said it was being warmly received across the country. A child from a migrant cotton-picking family stands in the Shafter camp in California in 1938. Many children in these camps lived in temporary shelters while their parents moved from field to field for seasonal work. In 1965, 20-year-old Helen Mirren played Cleopatra for the National Youth Theatre of Great Britain, long before global fame found her. This stage role came 42 years before she won the Academy Award in 2007. The only daughter of Kaiser Wilhelm II, Victoria Louisa of Prussia, was born in 1892 and outlived the German Empire by decades. Her 1913 marriage made her Duchess of Brunswick, and she died in West Germany in 1980. On the 13th of April, 1948, the Hadassah convoy on its way to Mount Scopus in Jerusalem was caught in an ambush. 78 Jewish doctors, nurses, students, patients, teachers, and Haganah members, along with one British soldier, died in the attack. Emperor Karl I walks past saluting officers in Italy, with Empress Zita and their children Otto and Adelheid beside him. He became ruler in 1916, and the Habsburg Empire was gone by 1918, making scenes like this part of its final years. In late 1944, Japan planned a secret strike on the United States using seaplanes launched from submarine aircraft carriers. Operation PX was canceled in March 1945 after Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu objected. In April 1933, Benito Mussolini appeared with Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922, and Mosley had launched his movement only in 1932, making this an early meeting between the old model and the new copy. In the 1890s, Japan, some girls from poor families were sent overseas under harsh contracts that began in extreme poverty. Many were taken from rural homes to ports and cities across Asia, turning family debt into a hidden export. In 1956, crowds filled Tbilisi around the Stalin monument during mass rallies in his defense. The demonstrations began after Nikita Khrushchev publicly denounced Stalin in 1956. Members of the all-black 369th Regiment pose on the ship taking them home on February 10, 1919, after service in the First World War. The unit spent 191 days in active service in France and became one of the most decorated American regiments of the war. Ypres in 1917 looked stripped to its walls after years of fighting in the First World War. After 1918, the city was rebuilt, and this same spot now looks calm again. The image shows a formal meeting room filled with delegates, papers, and microphones, with several men watching from glass booths above. It does not match the claimed 31st of July 1917 battlefield scene, because the visible setting is an indoor conference table. Broken gravestones lie scattered across a Christian cemetery in Jerusalem after 1967. East Jerusalem came under Israeli control in 1967, turning damaged sites like this into lasting symbols of that upheaval. In December 1964, Che Guevara walked through New York as Cuba's delegate to the United Nations, only 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He entered the United States under diplomatic immunity to speak at the United Nations General Assembly. Palestinian women carry large water jars across rough ground in the 1910s, turning a daily task into a striking line of balance and endurance. Before modern water systems reached many villages, water often had to be carried by hand in heavy clay jars over long distances. A young woman in Bethlehem wears traditional Palestinian embroidery, layered jewelry, and a tall headdress in this 1895 portrait. Bethlehem dress from this period was known for rich hand embroidery and coin jewelry that could show family status and local identity. One of the last known photos of Selena Quintanilla was taken in March 1995 when she was only 23. By then, she was already a Grammy winner, and her English crossover album arrived just months later. Palestinian women and children walk with their belongings near Tantura in 1948 after the village fell during the war. Hundreds from Tantura were displaced in 1948, and scenes like this became one of the defining images of the Nakba. In March 1945, Lieutenant Commander Gerald R. Pearson stands in camp after Iwo Jima, showing captured swords beside rows of tents. The Battle of Iwo Jima lasted from 19 February to 26 March 1945. A man described as a Tibeto-Mongol underworld figure poses in traditional dress in a stark 1990s portrait from the post-Soviet era. After 1991, the collapse of Soviet control opened space for new criminal groups and private power across parts of Inner Asia. In 1921, General John J. Pershing speaks at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. France had placed its unknown soldier there in 1920, making this one of the earliest great public memorials to the dead of the First World War. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt leaned from a train car to shake hands with a Native American rider on horseback. The photo was taken the same year Roosevelt ran for president again after already serving 2 terms. In 1957, a 28-year-old American civil rights leader stands beside Ghana's prime minister during the year Ghana won independence from Britain. That same year, he helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Irving Penn photographed 2 children from Cusco in Peru in 1948, using a plain backdrop that makes their pose feel unusually direct and still. A platinum palladium print made in 1973 from this image sold at Bonham's on April 8th for $76,700. Wild Bill Guarnere stands with Mike Ranney at Camp Toccoa in 1942, early in the training that would shape the men, later made famous by Band of Brothers. Camp Toccoa was where paratroopers of the 506th trained on Currahee Mountain before going to Europe. 2 cafeteria workers smile beside a busy soda fountain in the 1940s, surrounded by glassware, coffee pots, and chrome machines. Lunch counters like this were a major part of everyday city life before fast food chains spread across the United States after the war. During Operation Compass in late 1940 and early 1941, Australian troops carry a wounded Italian soldier across the desert while another sits nearby. Operation Compass destroyed much of the Italian 10th Army. Eliza Davis Roebuck and Amos Eastwood were photographed on their wedding day in Burnie, Australia, on October 12, 1898, after living together for decades and raising 8 children. She died just 1 week later at age 69. One of Franklin D. Roosevelt's last photos was taken on April 11, 1945, just 1 day before he collapsed at the Little White House in Georgia. On April 12, 1945, he told artist Elizabeth Shumatoff he had a terrible headache and was pronounced dead at 3:35. In June 1987, Yonsei University student Lee Han-yeol was photographed at a protest shortly before a tear gas canister struck him in Seoul. His case, together with the death of student Park Jong-chul, helped ignite the June Democratic uprising that pushed South Korea toward direct elections. Vice President Alban W. Barkley was photographed speaking on April 30, 1956, in one of his last public moments. About 2 minutes later, he finished a line about preferring service over power, then collapsed and died. Douglas MacArthur sits with President Lyndon B. Johnson at Walter Reed Hospital in one of his last known photos, taken on March 13, 1964. He died on April 5, 1964, at age 84, less than 1 month after this meeting. One of the last cabin photos of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 shows the young rugby team and other passengers relaxed in their seats on October 13, 1972. After the plane crashed in the Andes that day, 16 people were rescued 72 days later. This side-by-side image links Francisco Franco and Fidel Castro, 2 leaders whose governments kept ties after the Cuban Revolution despite their sharply different public ideologies. When the United States pushed its 1960 embargo line, Franco's Spain did not join it. In Józefów in 1942, German policemen stand beside Jewish civilians during one of the early mass actions in occupied Poland. Reserve Police Battalion 101 later became known for killing tens of thousands of Jews, and only a very small number of its men refused to take part. 16-year-old Edward Height stands between 2 police officers the day after his 1942 arrest in Connecticut. The case shocked the region and later ended with his execution in the electric chair, making him the youngest person put to death that way in Connecticut. In Munich on November 11, 1942, 2 unidentified Jewish girls wait for deportation in one of the last known images before their transport left Germany. Nearly 1,000 people were on that transport, and almost none survived after arrival in Lithuania. On January 30, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff sank in the Baltic Sea after a Soviet submarine hit it, while more than 10,000 people were on board, many of them refugees. It went down in about 1 hour, and more than 9,000 people died in the worst maritime disaster in history. Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate sit together in a 1958 photo from one of the most notorious crime cases in American history. The case was tied to 11 deaths, ended with Starkweather's execution, and later inspired Badlands, Natural-Born Killers. 18-year-old Ozilla Elizabeth Jones Rowan was photographed in Washington in 1912 after saying her former husband had threatened her when he left jail. He had already been jailed for attacking her, and less than 2 weeks after this photo, she was dead. Women patients stand in line at Pilgrim State Hospital in New York in 1938 in one of the starkest images of early psychiatric care in the United States. Opened in 1931, Pilgrim State was built for 10,000 patients. During the Siege of Warsaw in September 1939, Polish civilians cut meat from dead horses in the street after food supplies collapsed. The siege ended on 28 September 1939 after weeks of bombardment and severe shortages across the city. After the German air raids on Belgrade in April 1941, a tram lies crushed under a collapsed building in one of the city's starkest street scenes. The attack began on April 6, 1941, and within days, Yugoslavia was overrun by Axis forces. Emil Hacha rides back to Prague in March 1939 after the Berlin meeting that ended Czechoslovakia's independence. Within hours, German troops entered the country, and Bohemia and Moravia were turned into a protectorate. Albert Brown is led from a California courtroom in 1980 after receiving a death sentence for the killing of Susan Jordan. California had restored the death penalty in 1978, only 2 years before this sentencing. In 1946, Al Capone poses at his Miami home with his wife May and their grandchildren Diane, Ronnie, and Barbara. He died in 1947 at age 48, only months after this family photo was taken. Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson stand together in one of their last known photos, taken before the plane crash of February 3, 1959. The crash near Clear Lake, Iowa took all 3 lives that night, and the date later became known as the day the music died. Before global fame, Marilyn Monroe sits at a Malibu beach party in California in the mid-1940s, the woman in the large black jacket near the back. Shot on Kodachrome around 1945 to 1947, this image captures her before the name Marilyn Monroe was known around the world. Rachel McLish became the first Ms. Olympia on August 30, 1980, the moment women finally got their own top bodybuilding crown. She won the title again in 1982 and became one of the first major stars of women's bodybuilding. Finnish President Kyösti Kallio is seen at Helsinki Central Railway Station on December 19, 1940, in one of the last photos taken of him. Minutes after this image was made, he suffered a fatal heart attack at the station. This is the only known photo of Maria Goretti, taken in Italy in early 1902 when she was 11 years old. She died on the 6th of July, 1902, and the Catholic Church beatified her in 1947. An Ainu family stands together in 1903, wearing patterned robes that marked one of the indigenous peoples of Hokkaido. The Ainu language later fell into severe decline, and today, only a very small number of fluent speakers remain. An amateur bodybuilder poses in a small gym in the 1950s, wearing contestant number 12 beside barbells and dumbbells. Before modern fitness chains, serious lifters often trained in bare rooms like this, with simple iron weights and almost no machines. This is not a 1954 radio interview image, but an identification card with a portrait, fingerprints, and official stamps. The document is dated September 30, 1946, in Starnberg, so it shows a post-war identity record rather than a broadcast scene. One of the last known photos of Albert Einstein shows him outside his home in Princeton in 1955, looking frail but unmistakable. He died on the 18th of April, 1955, at age 76, only days after this image was taken. In April 1942, Japanese Americans stand outside a church just before being sent to internment camps. Executive Order 9066 led to the forced confinement of more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry in the United States. In August 1968, wrecked vehicles lay on the streets of Prague after Warsaw Pact forces moved in to crush the Prague Spring. The invasion ended Czechoslovakia's reform movement and turned the city into one of the Cold War's starkest street scenes. In 1930s Poland, marchers carried a banner reading "Africa, source of raw materials" during a rally by the Maritime and Colonial League. Poland later pushed colonial claims at the League of Nations, seeking overseas territory despite having no colonies of its own. On July 4, 1940, Robert Wadlow, the tallest person ever reliably recorded at 2.72 meters, was photographed at the National Forest Festival in Manistee. He died 11 days later at age 22, and no one has ever broken his height record. In the early 1960s, Eartha Kitt holds a one-arm balance on the beach in a rare show of strength and control. By then, she was already an international star in music, film, and stage after rising to fame in the 1950s. In 1928, Gordon Stewart Northcott showed police parts of his family farm during the Wineville case in California. the scandal became so infamous that Wineville changed its name to Mira Loma in 1930. In 1938, a mother and 6 children lived together in a single cramped room in a miners' boarding house in Mohegan, West Virginia. Photos like this captured how coalfield families often packed whole households into one rented room during the Depression. In April 1945, Red Army soldiers sitting in an American made M3A1 scout car talk with Berlin residents as the city neared the end of the war. The women wear white armbands, a common sign used by many Berlin civilians and refugees in the final days of the battle. On December 8, 1942, Ruth Wade and Lucille Mayo work as mechanics on a military truck. Part of a wartime shift, few black women had been allowed before. The Second World War opened defense jobs to many women, even as segregation still shaped where they could work. In Chisinau, on July 3, 1940, children handed flowers to Red Army soldiers during a parade marking Bessarabia's return to Soviet control. The Soviet Union had taken Bessarabia from Romania only days earlier, in late June 1940. On November 4, 1953, Marilyn Monroe arrived at the premiere of How to Marry a Millionaire and stopped to greet a young fan in the crowd. The film became one of the biggest hits of her career and helped lock in her rise as one of Hollywood's top stars. Andrew Mason stands with a child and bicycle in Kathmandu in September 1983 in one of the last photos taken before his final day. He was a Canadian medical student volunteering in Nepal, and he died the next day from dehydration after severe illness. On May 22, 1998, Frances Arsentiev reached the top of Mount Everest and became the first American woman to summit without extra oxygen. She and her husband Sergei both died during the descent after this photo was taken. In Little Rock in 1959, a white crowd marched against school integration, showing how fierce resistance remained after the city's earlier crisis. Only 2 years earlier, federal troops had been sent to Little Rock Central High School to enforce desegregation. Nikolai Vavilov, one of the Soviet Union's leading crop scientists, was photographed in prison in 1942. He was arrested in 1940 on espionage charges and died in a Soviet prison in January 1943. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.